Mr. Secretary, great to see you. Congratulations. What you and President Trump have demonstrated in the past year is clearly peace through strength, and I appreciate the leadership from both of you. We've talked a lot about Venezuelan oil. You know, I focus a lot on energy going to China, and three-quarters of all the oil that went from Venezuela out of the country there last year, 75% of it went to China. They got it at deep discounts. They lots of money back to Venezuela through oil for loan deals. Since the start of this blockade, basically Venezuela crude shipments to China have fallen dramatically. Can you assess or talk a little bit about the impact this has on China's broader energy strategy?
Just to be clear, it's a quarantine, not a blockade. A blockade is an act of war. It's a quarantine, and it's been very effective in the sense that it's given us this leverage. In fact, can I just add something, and this might be to Senator Murphy's question as well. The Venezuelan authorities are now identifying ships that they want us to grab. In fact, about a week and a half ago, we grabbed one of these ships. That was, because here's what happened in the aftermath of the Maduro. About 5 ships took off without authorization from the Venezuelans because they were controlled by some network in the country. With the cooperation of the interim authorities, we seized one of those ships. We brought it back into Venezuelan waters, handed the ship off to the Venezuelans, who in turn fed it into this mechanism, this short-term mechanism that I described to you was created. So we're seeing cooperation on that front. Now, I think your question more specifically was about China. Yeah, so look, China can buy Venezuelan oil, but they're going to have to buy it like everybody else in the world is going to have to buy it. Yeah, at the normal price. And that money is going to flow back to the benefit of the Venezuelan people in a structured way. And I know that in the short term, that will involve this mechanism we've described. In the long term, our intention is that it would be governed by a democratically elected government. You know, I mean, that like a normal country would handle it. But it's not just about oil. There's other economic activity, the full spectrum. I mean, Venezuela was, and still, we're not talking about some third world country here. I mean, we're talking about a country that doesn't just have wealth, it has memory, it has history of economic activity, of people who own chains of pharmacies. I know some of these people who own chains of retail stores, including American retailers who had a presence there. We just want it to be a normal, prosperous country again, not a playground for Iran, Russia, and China in our own hemisphere. And we're going to try to help them get that because we think it serves our national interest. That will require actions on our part, not money, but ultimately that will require them. This is ultimately going to be on the Venezuelan people and Venezuelan society and Venezuelan leaders to make this happen. We're going to be there to help and assist and create the parameters for it, and we feel like we're making really good progress. If we make as much progress over the next 4 weeks as we've made in the last 3.5 weeks, I'll feel very good about that. If it slows down or it gets complicated, I'll certainly let you know. But our anticipation is that we're going to be able to continue to work cooperatively with them because it's in their interest and ours. But I will point out to this, after this operation happened, look at the people who criticized it. I mean, there were others. China, Russia, Iran, Hamas. These were the people that were upset about this strike and this raid and what we did. And I can tell you that in many countries in the Western Hemisphere, there was great pleasure in the fact that Maduro was removed and that it didn't involve an all-out war and an invasion.
Since you mentioned Iran, and Senator McCormick mentioned Iran as well, a lot of oil is still going from Iran to China. 1 million barrels a day last year. Lots of that money goes back to Iran, to the dictators, the people that are actually killing others on the street. Can you talk a little bit about what we can do to prevent that from continuing to go and what we're doing to support the Iranian?
Some of that is sanctioned oil. This requires the willingness to enforce those sanctions. And obviously that comes with a cost-benefit analysis. The Iranians are also capable of seizing ships and doing that in retribution. But that's certainly something that will be under consideration, and others have done that in the past. And we have seized, for example, weapons shipments in the past that involve Iranian, and in fact, some of the ships, remember, all of these ships that we're seizing with the oil are with court orders. They're either one of two things. We either have a court order from a federal judge that allows us to seize it because it's in violation of a sanction, or it's a flagless vessel in the shadow fleet. And many of these ships here involve Iran. And some of that oil was going to be ultimately transferred to the excess refining capacity that China currently has.
You mentioned the word shadow fleet. Senator Shaheen and I have legislation on subsea cables. I've asked you about that the last time we were here. The sabotage being done, directly being targeted. I know that Sweden and Finland have both detained Russian ships along those lines. We're going to have a markup on that bill tomorrow. Is that something you continue to support our efforts to go after?
It is, and it's featured prominently in the agenda, both at the G7 this year, as it did somewhat last year, but again this year in the G7 will be one of the top items we'll be discussing. And we've also been pushing it as a priority for NATO to consider. The two new things we want NATO to make a priority this year in our conversations are the undersea cable infrastructure, and Arctic security, and the third is critical minerals and supply chains. Because ultimately, you can spend all the money in the world on weapons. If you can't make them because you're missing some chip that requires some mineral that China controls, you're in a lot of trouble.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Senator Kane. Thank you. We started this operation on September 2nd with the attack on Venezuelans and boats in open waters. And now we are nearly 5 months in. Next week is 5 months. Finally, a public hearing. Wow, how novel. Finally, a public hearing in the Senate or House. This is the first public hearing we've had. 200 folks who are on secret designated combatant lists have been killed. U.S. troops have been injured. Hundreds of millions of dollars have been spent. An armada amassed. The announcement of a new Monroe Doctrine, which does not land well in the Americas. Democrats have been asking over and over again, can we have a public hearing? Can we share what we know with the American public? Finally, a public hearing. But even that hearing is constrained. I'd like to talk about the complete weakness of the legal rationale about the strikes on boats in international waters, but I can't because the administration has only shared it with members in a classified setting. I can't tell you why the domestic rationale is hollow and the international rationale is hollow. I can't tell you why the rationale for attacking Venezuela is hollow because, again, the rationale has been shared with us in a closed setting. I can't share with you the grim details of the murder of shipwrecked survivors in open waters that we all know because we've seen the videos and we've questioned the U.S. military officials involved about legality because the administration will not release that publicly. They released the boat strike videos publicly, but they hid the second strike that killed struggling shipwreck survivors, even from Congress, for nearly 3 months, but I can't really talk to you about it. I can't talk to you about the weakness of the targeting criteria being used to attack boats in the Caribbean and Pacific. I would encourage any colleague, if you have not, go to the classified setting and ask for a briefing on each strike and ask this question: what was the evidence that there were narcotics on that craft? You will be very surprised if you ask that question about every strike. And so even in this first public hearing, 5 months in, there's a lot we can't talk about. If it was such a righteous operation, why is the administration and the majority in this Senate so jealously protecting the details about it from being revealed to the American public? I have Virginians deployed in this operation. I can't answer their families' questions. Thank God we're having a public hearing 5 months in. This is supposed to be the greatest deliberative body in the world. Mr. Secretary, who won the July 2024 Venezuelan presidential election?
Oh, I think the whole world would acknowledge it was Edmundo Gonzalez.
Who lost that election?
Maduro.
And his vice president, Delcy Rodriguez. Now, you have made the decision, the administration has made the decision in the aftermath of the attack that Delcy Rodriguez should be leading the country. Let me read something that President Trump said about her on January 14 about Delcy Rodriguez, who lost the election with Maduro. We just had a great conversation today, and she's a terrific person. I mean, she's somebody that we have worked with very well. Let me tell you what Delcy Rodriguez said the day after Venezuela was attacked. Governments around the world are simply shocked that the Bolivarian Republic of Venezuela is the victim and target of an attack of this nature, which undoubtedly has Zionist undertones. What the hell did Delcy Rodriguez mean when she said this attack had Zionist undertones? I'm assuming you have no idea.
Oh, I have an idea what she meant. I mean, what's the question?
What does she mean when she says this attack has Zionist undertones?
Look, I'd have to answer, but let me understand in a broader context. No one here is telling you that this is what we want to see in the long term.
Okay.
This is not a campaign to leave in place the system that's currently in place.
Let me switch.
But we either have but I mean the criticism of us is. All right, go ahead. No, go ahead.
I'm ready to switch now to talk about somebody that you
thought
know
you raised
well.
an important point. If I can get back to it, I will.
You know well and you respect well Maria Corina Machado. Here's what President Trump said about her. Won the Nobel Prize in the aftermath of the attack on Venezuela. I think it would be very tough for her to be the leader. She doesn't have the support within or the respect within the country. She's a very nice woman, but she doesn't have the respect. What did President Trump mean by that?
Yeah. First of all, I've known Maria Corina for probably 12 years,
I know you
13
have.
years. Have dealt with her probably more than anybody, as much as anybody on this committee has for certain. And I'll be meeting with her today, in fact. And we met with her a couple weeks ago. So here's the reality, though, and I think what the president was pointing to, and I think Maria Corina would acknowledge this.
The only way I talked to her last week.
Well,
She's very disappointed in those comments, and so are Venezuelans in my state.
Okay, well, she didn't share that with me or with us, but I would sell this to you. For the president is acknowledging is that today, as it stands, whether we like it or not, the elements of control in that country, the people with the guns, the people that control the guns and the institutions of government there, are in the hands of this regime. So we either, on the one hand, we're getting criticized. Some people are saying we don't want regime change. On the other hand, we're being criticized for not undertaking regime change.
Mr. Secretary,
What we're trying to trigger here is a process of stabilization, recovery, and transition to something where Maria Corina and others can be a part of.
You
and that's
have,
what we're working
you have
for.
respect for her, don't you?
Sure.
Okay, great. My last question is this.
And so does the president, by the way. He met with her. They had a great meeting. And he actually he spoke to her last week in my presence.
Here's what he said after that meeting. We're talking to her, and maybe we can get her involved in some way. I'd love to be able to do that. Maybe we can do that. We'll set the terms for this Nobel Prize winner having a leadership role. Last question is this. You talked about the speech in Davos. Here's something the president said in Davos. I'm helping NATO until the last few days when I told them about Iceland. They loved me. They're not here for us on Iceland, that I can tell you. Our stock market took the first dip yesterday because of Iceland, so Iceland has already cost us a lot of money. The president repeatedly mistook Iceland for Greenland, right? We're not mad at Iceland. They haven't cost us any money. The president just mistook the two countries for each other, correct?
Yeah, he meant to say Greenland, but I think we're all familiar with presidents that have verbal stumbles. We've had presidents like that before. Some made a lot more than this one.
Nice try. Thanks.
All right, thank you. I thought he did well. Let's see. We got Senator Paul.
Our founders debated extensively over which branch of government should have the power to declare or initiate war. Virtually unanimously, they decided, and what was entered into the Constitution was that the declaration or initiation of war would be the power of Congress. Now, we have many advocates, many of whom are here today, who have been advocates for an expansive notion of presidential power. They often argue that wars are not really wars, that they're kinetic actions or drug busts. I think, though, if you reverse the circumstances, it becomes very difficult for these arguments to hold up. So I would ask you, if a foreign country bombed our air defense missiles, captured and removed our president, and blockaded our country, would that be considered an act of war?
Well, I think your question is about and I will acknowledge you've been very consistent on all these points the entire career. So let me no matter who's in charge. So I will point to two things. The first is it's hard for us to conceive that an operation that lasted about 4.5 hours and was a law enforcement operation to capture someone we don't recognize as a state, indicted in the United States, wanted with a $50 million bounty.
My question would be, if it only took 4 hours to take our president, it's very short, nobody dies on the other side, nobody dies on our side, it's perfect. Would it be an act of war?
We just don't believe that this operation comes anywhere close to the constitutional definition of war.
But would it be an act of war if someone did it to us? Nobody dies, few casualties, they're in and out. Boom, it's a perfect military operation. Would that be an act of war? Of course it would be an act of war. I'm probably the most anti-war person in the Senate, and I would vote to declare war if someone invaded our country and took our president. So I think we need to at least acknowledge this is a one-way argument. One-way arguments that don't rebound, that you can't apply to yourselves, that cannot be universally applicable are bad arguments. So my next question would be, let's say it's not a war. And we're just going to define it away and say it's not a war. That's one of the arguments. So it's a drug bust. What if a foreign country indicts our president for violating a foreign law? Should we extradite our president, or should we be okay if they come in and get him by force?
Look, I think ultimately we're always going to act in our national interest. And so if somebody comes after our national interest, like the case you've described, which obviously does not exist at this time, but the case you've described, the U.S. always has the right to act in its national interest and to protect itself.
So really
I don't
it's
know about this equivalency. Well, does this justify them doing it? We're always going to do what's best for the United States and America. We're always going to protect our system.
But the point isn't, and you're exactly right, we will act in our national interest and we should. So I'm not disagreeing with you at all. What I'm saying is, though, that our arguments are empty then. The drug bust isn't really an argument, it's a ruse. The war argument, not a war, is a ruse. It's not a real argument. And we do what we do because we have the force, we have the might, we do it because it's in our interest. So we wouldn't let anybody come in, bomb us, blockade us, and take our president. We've had arguments about legitimate, illegitimate presidents, bad elections, rigged elections. So there's all kinds of same arguments that we've had in our country that they've had in Venezuela. But we wouldn't argue for an indictment. And these things aren't idle speculation. I mean, Netanyahu's been indicted by the ICC. And one of the reasons I object to being part of the ICC, and I would say you and the administration probably agree, is we're not going to let any international council indict our president and arrest him somewhere on foreign soil. We're not going to do that. We actually, most of us probably object to indicting Netanyahu in that way as well. So I think the arguments are invalid. So we did get the legal opinion that Senator Kaine referred to, the OLC opinion, Office of Legal Counsel. And I think a lot of it's been released. Plus, they came to our caucus and talked most of the open about everything they had classified. So I will talk about at least one of the arguments. They say this war wasn't a constitutional war, therefore it doesn't rise to the constitutional notion of us declaring or having to initiate the war. It just doesn't rise. And one of their main arguments was not enough people died. And so there is some number that they aren't specific, but there is some number. I would assume, although I'm not positive, but the 50, 60,000 soldiers who died in Vietnam might be enough for them to call that a war. But here's the problem. It isn't the number, it's that it happens in retrospect. See, our founders gave us the power to initiate or declare war. They didn't give us other powers to execute the war. Those are left to the president. But if we have to wait to see how many people are killed, we have to wait, as they describe it, as the scope, nature, and extent. If we have to wait to see the scope, nature, and extent, the war has been going on for some time. It's hard to vote to initiate a war that's been going on. And we can say this war is over, but we're still blockading it, and we may go back in. But there are no clear answers. You know, we put 2,000, we leave 2,000 troops in. Are we going to call that war and initiate it? So the definition of war is very important. And I think we have to acknowledge the problems with our argument. Calling things kinetic action is a disservice to our soldiers. Oh, you weren't really wounded in war. You don't have a Medal of Honor for war. You have a Medal of Honor for a kinetic action. So I think let's call it what it is, and let's vote on these things. But I think we're in violation of both the spirit and the law of the Constitution by bombing a capital, blockading a country, and removing elected officials. And we certainly wouldn't tolerate it, nor would I if someone did it to us.
Well, we didn't remove an elected official. We removed someone who was not elected, and it was actually an indicted drug trafficker in the United States. And their system...
Our laws, indicted under our laws. Look, Bolsonaro says that Da Silva is not really the president of Brazil. Our president said Biden wasn't really the president. Hillary Clinton said in 2016 Trump wasn't the president. So you have these arguments, and I agree with you, it probably was, and most likely was, most assuredly was a bad election. He wasn't really elected. But at the same time, if that's our predicate, and you don't have to come to us because it's a drug bust, we're just removing somebody, you can see where it leads to, and it leads to chaos. And that's why we have rules like the Constitution, so we don't get so far out there that presidents can do whatever they want. It is this check and balance. And I would argue for 70 years we've been going the wrong way. It isn't just this president, but it's a debate that I think is worth having.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I want to associate myself with the comments of Tim Kaine. The fact that we're 5 months into this and this is the first oversight hearing is really a complete failure of the responsibility of Congress. Failure of this committee to demand oversight, but also a reflection of the reluctance of the administration to engage in the proper consultation with Congress. So I hope we can do a lot better going forward, and that we'll see you at least every 6 weeks or so, not every five months. I also feel like the strategy of keeping basically these very weak arguments secret so that they can't be discussed openly for the legal justifications. I've gone down and read them, and there's a reason obviously you'd be incredibly embarrassed if those were public. So make them public. Let's have an actual transparency here in the United States of America. And let's be clear about what has gone on. We had a dictator we didn't like. We've replaced it with a dictator we think we can manipulate. And if that doesn't work, we'll do something else in order to pry open that economy for oil. And I must say that you did say something I liked. So let me emphasize that.
We're making progress.
Yeah. You said no U.S. taxpayer dollars will be used, no spending on our part, to kind of prop up Venezuela. Can you restate your commitment to that?
Yeah, they're not going to need it. For example, we're not spending money in Venezuela right now. I mean, obviously, look, I think you're putting aside embassy operations and all of that. And by the way, there may be some program through foreign aid that some of you might be interested in the future. We don't think that Venezuela is the kind of country that needs that. This is a very wealthy country.
Thank you. I'm glad you restated that, because I think that we will see some moment when the administration says, let's subsidize our American oil companies to rebuild the infrastructure in Venezuela. And I must say that's a very unpopular idea among my constituents. I think America needs a lot of investments in infrastructure here. And I think you have a way too rosy sense of the oil economy there. Many experts have said, look, without 10-year prospect horizon of stability, without Canada deciding to ship a lot more of its heavy oil instead of to the Gulf, doing it to Asia so that we prop up the kind of demand in the Gulf, without keeping Iran off the international stage so that the cost of oil, the value is higher. All of those factors would have to be there for our oil companies to want to invest their own money. So I think they'll be coming to the administration. I think you'll all be trying to find some way to subsidize them. But I'm glad what you said today, that you're not going to do it, and I want to hold the administration accountable to that. Second, on terms of the $500 million fund, $300 million, my understanding, has gone back to the Central Bank of Venezuela, and they have essentially exchanged it for bolivars to key industry players. I don't think we have any transparency on what corporations or entities got that hard currency, and yet you did say there's going to be a lot of transparency. You also said, if I understood right, that those funds are eventually going to be brought back into the structure of U.S. control as part of our, formal structure of funds. And in that sense, the Constitution says no money shall be drawn from the Treasury, but in consequence of appropriations made in law. So are you going to make sure that if that money comes back into kind of full U.S. control, not an offshore account the way it is now, that we're going to abide by the Constitution? Third point here is that one of the things that transpired is cutting off the oil to Cuba. And I know you have a strong interest in making life difficult for the leadership in Cuba. Can you lay out for us what other things you might be planning in that regard and how those fit into an overall plan?
Yeah, well, I'll try to do that in a minute. Let me just say on the rosy projections of oil, it's not rosy projection. I mean, it's either going to happen or it's not. In essence, well, there's no world in which the United States is subsidizing investment in Venezuelan oil. It's very simple. Oil company will go in and say, okay, this is the oil you have. This is how much it's going to cost us investing on the front end to one end make money, pay back our investment plus a profit at the back end. And then depending on the terms of that investment, they'll make a decision about whether it makes sense for that or not. Right now, what you have in Venezuela is a corrupt and broken oil company run by the government that basically takes this money, doesn't reinvest in it at all, and basically sprinkles it to its people to keep the glue that keeps the regime together. We want it to become a normal oil economy. That's what the ultimate goal is here. And in a normal oil economy, companies are going to go in, they're going to look at Venezuelan law, they're going to look at Venezuelan authorities, and they're going to make a determination about whether or not it's worth their investment. And that's the normalization process that we're talking about. That's going to be up to them. If they want to have a normal oil economy as opposed to one that is basically used as a way to feed graft in a very inefficient way, but they didn't care about that. If they do it the right way, we think it has great promise and potential over the long term, especially because these investments take a long time. But the U.S. doesn't have to put any money to encourage companies to go in and invest, nor is there any interest in doing so. But a lot of it.
That's a point I really do appreciate.
Yeah, no,
I don't want to see.
Well, I don't even think that's even
been.
I don't think that's even been discussed or considered by anybody. Your second point was. I wrote it here, but now.
It's the $300 million
I left here,
being
I've had to start
redistributed
using
to
these. I
corporations in Venezuela. And,
The second one was what, I'm sorry?
lack of accountability over that. The $300
Oh,
million
yeah.
has already been distributed.
On the account. So that's not the permanent structure we want to see. In the long term, we just want them to have a normal industry where the companies are involved in there, they're selling it directly to the market, and we're out of that game. What we're talking about now is the sanctioned oil, the oil that's under our sanction. So we have to monitor how that money moves. So yes, the first 300 million moved for the following reason. We would all agree we didn't want to see systemic collapse. Like one of the things a lot of you told me you were worried about on the short term is this is going to trigger internal chaos in Venezuela. 1 million people are going to storm the border with Colombia. Colombia even stood up troops to their border to prevent it. Brazil was worried about it as well. It's going to lead to fighting in the streets between rival factions and shooting. None of that has happened. And key to that stabilization is ensuring that the government had enough money to meet payroll and meet their basic needs as part of the stabilization. We should not confuse stabilization with transition. This is not what the permanent structure is going to look like. Look, the Treasury's handling the structuring of that account, so I would refer you to them, and I can get you an answer for them as to what the legal framework of that Treasury blocked account is going to look like.
That'd be very helpful, because what you just mentioned, money to meet payroll, is very different than what we've heard about the money being used to give hard currency to key corporations inside of Venezuela, which would not be meeting payroll.
Well, which
This is where complete oversight is required.
Well,
We'd like to have transparency over how that's being done.
Remember, the first 300 million we're going to have to, on that one, because of the urgency in moving funds to keep the place stable, is going to require us to undertake a retroactive audit of how that money was spent, the first 300 million. But there's probably another 2.5 to 3 billion down the pike at some point, which will have front end through this process I described. I'm not sure if you were here where I described it, and we're still finalizing it. But basically, the way it would look is we would send them a letter saying, on the sanctioned oil proceeds, this is what it could be spent on, and you have to agree to contribute. You have to agree to pay for an auditing system to make sure that that's how it's being spent. That's the process we're trying to create. Again, on Friday will mark the 4-week mark of this all began. I understand, we live in a world where the items move very quickly. This was front page news of 3 weeks ago when we scheduled this hearing, and today other items have captured the attention, but we remain focused on it. So it's only been 3 or 4 weeks, but that's the process we're setting up with Treasury, and obviously as we finalize it, we'll provide that to you. But this is not permanent. This is not the system we want to see in place in the long term. We want to see a normal country. What was your third question?
Cuba.
Oh, Cuba.
Cuba.
Oh, okay. I'll tell you about Cuba.
Okay. Secretary Rubio, as you know, in our home state, this was very popular. Cubans, Venezuelans, Nicaraguans, basically everybody in Latin America has been fighting. A lot of them are in Miami, as you know, because they've had to leave these countries because of socialism and lack of opportunity. So what the president did, the willingness of the president with your support and with Pete Hegseth's and military was very, very, very well thought of. So the first thing I want to say is on behalf of Floridians, thank you for what you guys did. Now the next is everybody has these ridiculously high expectations, which we all do. We would love to have a free and fair election tomorrow, where there was you knew that there was no oppression. Everybody wanted to run; they could run. So, tell us how should Venezuelans and Cubans and Nicaraguans look at this, and how patient should they be, and what would be the sort of the milestones you would give them to look at to say we are making progress?
Well, first I would remind everybody, let's just go back 6 months, 8 months, a year ago at this time. The Venezuelan challenge for us was frozen. It was a frozen situation. We had a regime that was entrenched. Its opposition was either in hiding or had been forced overseas. Edmundo Gonzalez lives in Spain. Maria Corina is no longer, she's very brave. She stood there as long as she could, but she had to leave. The others are in jail. They were increasing their relationships and outreach with Iran, and currently have existing ones with Russia, Cuba, and China. And other than more sanctions and more speeches and more threats and whatever, it was a frozen situation. Now, for the first time in literally a decade, there is the opportunity that something could change. There's not the guarantee that something will change, but there is the opportunity that something will change. We have changed that dynamic, which goes back to the question that Senator Merkley had about Cuba. What we are looking for is the opportunity for a change in dynamic. That's a country that's been backwards. It has no functional economy. The people, you can call them Marxist, we can call them communist, but not even Lenin would recognize this version of communism and Marxism that they've instilled in Cuba. It's an economic model that hasn't worked anywhere on the planet. The suffering in the rural areas of Cuba are acute and they're deep. And it's not because of the embargo, it's because they don't know how to run an economy. How is it the fault of the US embargo that Cuba, one of the world's largest sugar producers, now imports sugar? Because no sector of their society works. It's frozen and it's broken. But in the case of Venezuela, we have a glimmer of hope now, the opportunity to change the dynamic. Now, what that will require is smart decisions on our part, but ultimately it will require decisions made by Venezuelans, both those currently in charge of the interim authorities and those who may be in charge in the future as well to step forward. It is our sincere belief that the only way you're going to have a free, prosperous Venezuela that's allied with the United States is one in which every sector of their society is represented in their politics. And that includes many people who currently live abroad. And even the opposition, people like to say the opposition is very diverse. There are members of the opposition that were once part of Chavismo and turned against it. There are members of the opposition that have never been Chavistas, like Maria Corina Machado, and have been very forceful against it. So that broad sector has to be represented as well. So you have to have a process of internal reconciliation that allows these voices to begin to participate in the political life of that country, and that ultimately bring us to a point in which you can have a country where all of these elements of their society are represented in their politics. And look, there's a percentage of the Venezuelan population, I don't know what the number is, whether it's 15 or 20, that may not have liked Maduro, but are still committed to Chavista ideology. And they'll be represented in that platform as well. They may not win elections, but they'll be involved in this. That'll be up to the Venezuelan people. But our desire here is to have, what's the end state? We want a Venezuela that has legitimate democratic elections, sometimes elects leaders that are friendly to the United States, sometimes elects leaders that maybe are not the person we would have wanted to win, but that's not unique for us. That happens all over the world. We're not disputing that Petro is the legitimately elected president of Colombia, and yet he doesn't always say nice things about us. So, but we also want a Venezuela that's prosperous and a Venezuela that's aligned with the United States. And a year ago at this time, this was frozen. Now we have a real opportunity, not just to create change systemically within that country through our help, but their efforts,